The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Katie Rodriguez moves through the third-floor corridor of Sacred Heart Hospital with the practiced invisibility of someone who's learned that being seen is dangerous. Her scrubs are navy blue, unremarkable. Her name tag reads K. Rodriguez, RN, in letters small enough that most people don't bother. It's 11:11 p.m. on a Tuesday, which means the night shift is hers alone, and that's exactly how she needs it. She pushes through the staff locker room door. The air smells like industrial bleach and something floral, someone's cheap perfume lingering from the day shift. Her locker is second from the end, deliberately chosen for the angles it provides. She changes her shoes with the same methodical precision she applies to every movement, remove the worn Saucony sneakers, unlace them slowly, place them on the shelf. Then she reaches for the bottom of the locker, beneath the spare scrubs and the empty lunch container, and pulls out a bundle wrapped in a grey towel. Combat boots. They're weathered the color of old sand, with scuff marks that tell stories she can't speak aloud. The laces are still tied the way she left them 3 years ago in Ramadi, before she walked away from active duty. Before the screaming in her head became louder than mortar fire. She touches the leather ones, just the briefest contact, then wraps them back in the towel and tucks them into the shadows where they belong. Her hand shakes slightly as she reaches for her hospital badge. She steadies them by gripping the locker door. 3 weeks at Sacred Heart and no one has noticed the tremor. They notice the coffee cup shaking at the nursing station. Sure, they've made jokes about the anxious new girl, but they haven't seen what those same hands can do. They haven't watched them start and fall on a child's scalp vein with a 24-gauge needle while a sandstorm hammered corrugated metal walls. They haven't seen them perform needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, watching the sinus rhythm return on a monitor while rounds of ammunition cracked overhead. Those hands belong to someone else now. Someone with a different name. Katie moves through the hospital corridors like a ghost. The night shift stretched thin across 3 floors, skeleton crew, barely enough staff to respond to emergencies. That's why she volunteered for it immediately when she took the position. Emergency rooms after midnight are chaos wrapped in fluorescent light, and chaos is where invisible people do their best work. She's already memorized the layout, the medication dispensary on the 2nd floor, the supply closet with the good gauze, the back stairwell that doesn't trigger the motion sensors as loudly as the main stairs. Room 347 is on the 3rd floor, West Wing. That's where she stops first, before she even clocks in at the nursing station. The Admiral lies in the bed like something already departed. Monitors beep their rhythmic protest around him, heart rate in the low 50s, oxygen saturation barely holding at 88%, blood pressure sagging toward shock. The ventilator hisses its mechanical breath into his lungs, the sound like a tire leak in a quiet garage. His name is James Whitmore, 76 years old, admitted 5 days ago with sepsis secondary to aspiration pneumonia. Every specialist has signed off. The cardiologist wrote "not candidate for intervention" in neat letters on his chart. The pulmonologist documented a terminal decline, comfort care recommended. They've drawn a line under him in the language of medicine, and that line says, "give up." Katie reads his chart at the foot of his bed, the plastic pages whispering against her fingers. Admiral James Whitmore, Naval Academy class of 1979. Commander of Joint Task Force Helmand from 2008 to 2010. Decorated service. Multiple commendations. A photograph on his dresser shows him in dress whites, standing beside a young sailor, a kid no older than 22, dark hair, the kind of eager intensity in his eyes that says he's never seen combat yet. She recognizes the uniform. Navy working blues, the color of Miguel's uniform the day she drove him to boot camp at Great Lakes. The Admiral in this photograph is wearing the rank insignia pins. He's the one who puts them on the sailors when they earn their first set. She's seen the video twice, on a video call from Miguel that cut out halfway through, her son's voice breaking with pride he wasn't allowed to speak aloud while she sat in her car in the parking lot and tried to breathe. Admiral Whitmore's eyes are closed. His chest rises and falls with the ventilator's rhythm, not his own. The sepsis has ravaged him, white count through the roof, lactate climbing, organs starting their slow shutdown sequence. In the language of medicine, this is called multi-organ failure. In the language of people who've held dying soldiers, it's called time. Katie pulls up his vital signs on the monitor at the bedside. Heart rate 52. Respiratory rate 14, but that's the ventilator working, not him. O2 sat 88. Blood pressure 104/64 and drifting. The numbers tell a story of a body deciding to leave. She's read this story before. She's lived versions of it. But this is the man who pinned her son's insignia. She hears footsteps in the corridor and steps back from the bed, her face neutral, her presence already fading into the background. This is a skill that took years to develop, the ability to be in a room without occupying space in anyone's mind. She moves like a shadow, adjusting position slightly, becoming even more invisible. Dr. Marcus Sterling rounds the corner with 3 residents trailing behind him like ducklings following a drake. He's 48, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way that suggests expensive grooming rather than age. His watch catches the fluorescent light, Rolex, probably, the kind that costs more than Katie's monthly rent. His shoes are Italian leather, the kind that echoes differently on linoleum than rubber-soled work boots. Everything about him announces hierarchy, the way he walks without checking if people are in his path, the way he doesn't look at the staff, the way he holds the patient chart like it's a script he's already memorized. He stops at room 347 and doesn't enter. He simply glances at the monitors from the doorway, reads the numbers, and nods with the satisfied expression of a man checking an investment losing value. The residents crowd behind him, taking notes without asking questions. Whitmore, Sterling says, and his voice carries the tone of someone cataloging inventory. Terminal. Comfort care protocol. Any significant change, we call it. No escalation. He doesn't wait for acknowledgement. He's already moving toward the next room, the next body, the next calculation of profit and loss. One of the residents lingers for a moment, a young woman whose badge reads Dr. Chen, Internal Medicine. She looks at the monitors, at the Admiral's face, at the wedding ring on his left hand, and her jaw tightens. Katie watches her take a breath like she's about to say something, and then she follows Sterling down the corridor, swallowed by the group. Katie waits until the footsteps fade. Then she steps back into room 347 and sits down in the chair beside the Admiral's bed. She doesn't touch him. She simply sits in the silence created by the ventilator's rhythm and allows herself to recognize him. The angle of his chin. The way his breathing has that slight catch at the end of each exhale, pain, even unconscious, leaves its signature on bodies. She knows his face because she's seen it in Miguel's video calls, the Admiral standing in the background during base visits, always in frame but never quite in focus. "Your sailor is strong," she says quietly. The Admiral doesn't respond. The monitors keep their rhythm. She sits with him for 17 seconds, which is all the invisibility she can afford, and then she stands and moves back into the corridor, becoming a ghost again. The nursing station at 347 is quiet. Katie settles into the chair and boots up the computer. The password to access patient records is Sacred Heart 2019 because apparently the hospital's IT department has never heard of security. She's already reviewed the files twice, but the discrepancies are getting worse. The CT scan from yesterday doesn't exist. She knows this because she watched the patient, Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, room 362, pneumonia. She watched her be transported to CT at 3:15 p.m. She helped position her on the stretcher. She held her hand during the anxiety spike. And then she checked the radiology system this morning and found a CT chest with contrast documented, billed to Medicare, with the radiologist's signature already signed off on a report dated for 3:33 p.m., 15 minutes before the machine was actually shut down for maintenance, according to the engineering logs. The equipment order from Coastal Medical Supply is also curious. 7 digital thermometers, ordered on a Monday, delivered on Tuesday, signed for by Sterling himself, and then nothing. They don't appear on any patient floor inventory. They're not in the supply closet. They're not in the medication cabinet. But Coastal Medical Supply sent an invoice for $1,847, and it's been paid by hospital accounts within 72 hours. Katie opens a separate document and begins making notes. She's not trying to be clever. She's not trying to be a hero. She's simply trying to understand what's happening in the hospital where she's chosen to disappear, and the answer is making the muscles in her jaw tighten. It takes her 40 minutes to trace the pattern. Phantom procedures. Duplicate orders. Invoices paid to suppliers that exist just barely. Coastal Medical Supply has a P.O. box in Savannah and a phone number that doesn't answer. The money flows like a river, and Dr. Sterling's signature appears on every manifest, every authorization, every request for expedited payment. She's still reviewing the patterns at 2:16 a.m. when Sterling appears in the doorway of the nursing station. He's not on call tonight. He shouldn't be here. She realizes immediately, maybe 2 seconds before he speaks, that she's made a mistake. She's been too thorough. She's been too focused. She's been too visible. Burning the midnight oil. Sterling's voice comes with that tone again, the one that announces ownership of space. He's holding a coffee cup from the 24-hour cafeteria downstairs. He's not looking at her screens. He's looking at her face. Chart review for the new girl. Katie's hands don't tremble. She closes the Coastal Medical Supply invoice and brings up a standard medication reconciliation form. Making sure records match orders, she says, keeping her voice soft, deferential. Senior Chief Rodriguez would say something direct. Katie Rodriguez says nothing that might be remembered. Sterling walks past her without stopping. She can smell his cologne, something expensive with undertones of leather and smoke. He moves to the medication dispensary and uses his override code to access controlled substances that don't match any patient orders, pulls out what appears to be oxycodone bottles, and places them in his white coat pocket. He doesn't look at Katie while he does this. He doesn't check if anyone is watching. He already knows that on night shift, there's nobody. When he leaves, she doesn't react. Her face remains still. Her hands stay flat on the desk. She waits until his footsteps fade down the corridor and then she exhales slowly through her nose, the way she was taught to breathe during panic attacks. The way she's learned to breathe when the screaming starts. The cafeteria incident happens the next morning at 6:38 a.m., right as the day shift is beginning to arrive. Katie is standing in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee and a hard-boiled egg. She's not hungry. She hasn't been hungry in 3 weeks, which is either a symptom or a feature. She stopped trying to determine which, but breakfast is easier to hold than company. She's standing at the back of the line, waiting for the rush to clear, when Sterling walks in with 2 residents in tow. He spots her immediately. She knows this because she's trained to know when she's being hunted. The subtle shift in his posture. The way his eyes track her like a predator identifying prey that might be injured. He launches into a story loud enough that the entire cafeteria hears it. He's describing the night shift nurses, how turnover is brutal because new people can't handle the pressure, how he usually gives them a week before they're desperately writing their resignation letters. He's not looking at Katie, but the story is for her ears. The residents laugh on cue, that obedient kind of laughter that says they're performing hierarchy rather than finding humor. "I'll bet $100, Sterling says, and now he does glance in Katie's direction, that our new friend over there doesn't make it 7 days. Anyone want to cover that?" One of the residents, the younger one, eager, probably concerned about his evaluation, says, "You're on, Dr. Sterling." The cafeteria has gone quieter. Katie can feel the attention. She can feel them waiting to see if she'll react, if she'll flush with anger, if she'll retreat. She's learned that moment happens in every hostile environment, the moment when the bully is testing to see if you're prey. She turns around. She makes direct eye contact with Sterling. Her hands are steady. Her face is composed with the kind of composure that comes from having already survived worse. She holds his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough that it's deliberate, short enough that it's not a challenge. Then she speaks, her voice quiet enough that people have to strain to hear it, steady as a held rifle. "I've picked up pieces of people, doctor," she says. "Papers don't scare me." The cafeteria goes very still. Sterling's expression doesn't change, but something shifts behind his eyes. She's revealed something without revealing anything. She's responded to his dominance display with the calm certainty of someone who's actually encountered genuine danger, and he recognizes it even if he doesn't understand it. He turns away, takes his coffee, moves toward the exit. The residents follow him without speaking. Katie stands in the middle of the cafeteria with her hard-boiled egg and her coffee, and she feels the weight of attention settling on her. She's made a mistake. She's supposed to be invisible. She's supposed to survive by not being noticed. And now she's the person nobody was wondering about, and that's infinitely more dangerous. But she picks up her tray and walks out of the cafeteria anyway, because some things can't be swallowed even when they need to be. Katie walks out of the cafeteria with her shoulders level and her breathing controlled, the kind of breath work that used to keep her alive in places where sound meant death. The shame isn't hers to carry. She knows this. Her hands know this. Her hands have done worse than drop a lunch tray in front of an audience. But her hands are shaking anyway. She makes it 3 hallways before Sterling catches her near the medication dispensary, near enough to the nurse's station that people can see but not close enough to hear. He approaches from her left, the blind side, the way you move when you want someone to flinch. Katie doesn't flinch. She never flinches anymore. It's muscle memory that runs deeper than fear. He shoulder checks her anyway. It's not gentle. It's calculated. His body weight is deliberate, his angle precise, and Katie's lunch tray, fresh from the cafeteria line, untouched now except for the condensation ring of her water glass, arcs upward like something launched into space. Spaghetti explodes across the tile floor. Green jello slides in geometric patterns. The tray itself clatters with the sound of all the small humiliations stacking on top of each other, metal on linoleum, a noise that bounces off the walls of the hallway like a bell nobody wanted to ring. The corridor goes still. 2 nurses froze mid-conversation. A resident pushing a supply cart stops walking. Someone's pager beeps, but it feels like the sound is coming from underwater. Sterling steps directly over the scattered mess, his shoe landing in the middle of the spaghetti with deliberate indifference, and he turns back to face Katie with the satisfied expression of a man who has just proven something to an audience. "Clumsy," he says to the silent hallway. Not to her. To them. Always to them. Katie kneels. The motion is controlled, methodical, the way you move when you're counting your breaths and managing your heartbeat and pretending that you don't have 17 years of memory living in your muscle tissue telling you exactly how to make someone regret this moment. She picks up the tray first. Then the utensils, one by one. The jello is mostly salvageable. She scrapes it back into the bowl with her fingers, because there's no dignity in any of this anyway, and dignity was something she left in Ramadi in a place she doesn't talk about. The spaghetti she leaves. Some things are meant to be lost. She wipes her hands on her scrubs, wipes red sauce from the hem of her sleeve, stands up with the tray held level and her spine straight. Nobody moves. Nobody says anything. The silence has texture now, has weight, has the quality of something that's about to break. Sterling is already walking away, already checking his phone, already performing the role of a man who has moved on to more important things. Katie carries the broken lunch back to the break room and sets the tray on the counter next to the sink. She pours the water down the drain and listens to it spiral away. The fluorescent lights hum their constant mechanical song. She counts to 10. She counts to 20. She washes her hands until the water runs clear. When she returns to the nurse's station the next morning, the Admiral's labs are worse. Oxygen saturation down to 87% despite the supplemental oxygen. His heart rate is climbing, compensatory, stressed, running on fumes. The charts spread across the desk like a map of slow drowning, and Katie's reading them with her finger tracing the downward slopes, following the progression of a man being abandoned by every specialist in the hospital. Sterling appears behind her without warning. He has a talent for this, for moving through space without announcing himself, for making his presence known through violation rather than greeting. He reaches over her shoulder and sweeps the entire stack of patient charts across the desk. Papers scatter like wounded birds, like white noise made visible, like chaos delivered with a single gesture. They settle across the floor of the nurse's station in a spreading mess of data and diagnosis and the accelerating timeline of a man running out of time. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling says, his voice carrying the tone of someone issuing an order to a subordinate. File management is more your speed than actual medicine. The nurse's station goes cemetery silent. Katie breathes. One measured inhale. The kind of breath that used to come before breach and clear operations, before moving into rooms where the wrong movement meant death. The oxygen fills her lungs and settles her heart rate. She feels it working, feels the autopilot engaging, feels the part of her that is still senior chief petty officer responding to the provocation with the systematic coolness of someone who has processed worse than professional humiliation. A single tear escapes her left eye. It's not fear. It's not sadness. It's something else, something that lives in the place between restraint and release, the trembling that comes from holding something back with everything you have. She wipes it away without breaking eye contact. Without flinching. Without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. Then she speaks in a voice steady as a held rifle, level as a held scope, the voice that used to give orders in places where hesitation got people killed. "I've picked up pieces of people, doctor. Papers don't scare me." Sterling's jaw tightens. She sees it happen, sees the micro-movement of muscle beneath skin, sees the moment he realizes that something about his calculation was wrong. He forces a laugh. It sounds like a dog barking in an empty house, all aggression and no substance, and he turns away, walking back toward the physician's lounge with his phone already in his hand, already moving on to the next thing, already planning something worse. The nurse's station remains silent. Katie kneels slowly and begins picking up the charts. One by one. She reads the names as she collects them. Mrs. Patterson, room 412. Mr. Jackson, ICU bed 3. Admiral Thomas Whitmore, room 347. Her hands organize them by floor, by patient, by the systematic logic of someone who is very good at bringing chaos back into order. She doesn't cry. Not here. Not in front of witnesses. That's the part of her that is still military, still operational, still understanding that breaking in public is a luxury. The tears come later, after shift, in her car with the door locked and the engine off and the silence of Savannah pressing in through the windows. Her phone buzzes around noon. A text from Miguel, her son, somewhere in the Persian Gulf on a destroyer that she's not allowed to ask detailed questions about. The timestamp shows he sent it at 02 for 7 hours local time, which means he wasn't sleeping. Katie stares at the message for a long time. She's read the Admiral's letters to Miguel. She reads between the lines the way she learned to read between lines when she was the one writing them, the way you write when you're trying to say goodbye without making it sound like goodbye. The Admiral's handwriting has been getting shakier. His letters have been getting shorter. His latest one arrived 3 days ago with a single paragraph about legacy and duty and the strange grace of knowing exactly when your time has run out. She doesn't know how to tell Miguel that she's watching it happen. She doesn't know how to explain that the man who pinned his insignia at boot camp is dying 30 feet from where she stands at midnight, and that Dr. Sterling has made sure nobody's going to stop it. She types back, **** soon. I promise. ***. It's not a promise she knows how to keep. That evening, standing at the nursing station during the midnight watch, Katie understands something with the clarity of tactical assessment. She's made herself visible by caring about the wrong patient. She's made herself vulnerable by knowing about Sterling's fraud. She's made herself a problem by being competent enough to notice things that should have stayed invisible. The night shift staff moves around her like water around stone. The monitors beep their continuous song. The fluorescent lights hum their electric frequency. Somewhere in the hospital, a code is being called in a voice filtered through a paging system, and nurses are running toward emergency in a way that Katie used to run, in a way that lives in the muscles even when the mind has tried to leave it behind. She pulls up the Admiral's chart one more time and reads the most recent note from the pulmonology team. Patient remains a poor candidate for intervention. Recommend comfort care measures. Prognosis grave. Translation, we've given up. Translation, he's going to die. Translation, there's nothing left to do but make him comfortable while he goes. Katie knows exactly how wrong that translation is. She knows it in her hands. She knows it in the muscle memory that used to be called into action in rooms that no longer exist, against problems that required solutions that hospitals don't teach in standard nursing school. But knowing something and being able to act on it are separated by an ocean of consequences that she's only beginning to understand. The break room at Sacred Heart smelled like burnt coffee and regret at 1:56 a.m. Katie sat at a table scarred with decade-old pen marks, her phone glowing in the dark, Miguel's message waiting like a loaded gun. Mom, you still in Savannah? The Admiral, my CO, he's been at Sacred Heart 3 weeks. Nobody talks about him. He's just fading. You hear anything? The words hit differently when they came from her son. She couldn't answer honestly without burning every bridge she'd built, every invisible day she'd constructed to disappear from the person she used to be. Not answering was its own kind of lie. She typed nothing. Deleted everything. Set the phone down and stared at the fluorescent ceiling, counting the hum of lights like a ticking clock. The walk from the break room to the 3rd floor took 40 seconds. Katie had timed it once. 40 seconds through corridors where nobody knew her name, where she moved like a shadow between shifts, where her past didn't leak through the cracks of her scrubs. At 1:56 a.m., those 40 seconds changed everything. She passed room 347 and heard it before she saw it, the breathing wrong. Not the slow mechanical wheeze of a patient circling the drain. This was rapid. Desperate. Shallow gasps that sounded like a motor losing compression. Katie's hand on the doorframe. She pushed in. The Admiral lay against white pillows, his chest heaving, color draining from his face like someone pulling a cork from a bottle. The monitor showed oxygen saturation at 84 and dropping. 82. Trachea visibly deviated left. Jugular veins distending with each failed breath. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart, crushing the great vessels, turning blue code mechanics into minutes instead of hours. Katie hit the code button and walked backward out of the room. Protocol. Wait for a physician. Stay in your lane. The words felt like chains. 2 minutes. That's how long nobody came. The hallway stayed empty. The ER was buried under a 7-car pileup on I-95. The attending was deep in a thoracotomy on the 2nd floor. The resident on call had his hands inside someone's abdomen and couldn't move. Katie stood in the doorway of room 347 and felt the weight of 2 decisions pressing against her spine like shrapnel. One decision kept her anonymous, invisible, safe. The other one kept a man breathing. She thought of Miguel's voice on deployment calls, talking about the Admiral like he was gravity, the man who centered him, who showed him what leadership looked like when bullets were real. Who had pinned his naval aviator insignia 5 years ago in a ceremony Katie watched through a smartphone screen, her hand shaking so hard she could barely see. The same man now suffocating 12 doors down while she stood in a hallway doing nothing. Katie walked into room 347 and locked the door. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. Not shaking anymore. Steady as surgery. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, the size for emergency decompression, and found the 2nd intercostal space at the midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were still there. The muscle memory was still there. Ramadi had given her those memories and she'd buried them deep, but they didn't die. They just waited. She swabbed the site with an alcohol prep, felt the resistance of skin, felt the needle slide through the 1st rib intercostal space with a sensation like puncturing a membrane that had been holding pressure for years. The hiss came next. That sound. The air escaping under tension, rushing out like a scream the Admiral's damaged lung had been unable to voice. The sound of pressure releasing. The sound of survival. Katie's hand didn't waver. She threaded the catheter through the needle, withdrew the sharp, secured the line, and the Admiral's breathing changed from drowning to gasping to, slowly, stabilizing. His oxygen saturation climbed. 84. 87. 90. The color returned to his face like someone had flipped a switch inside him. Katie grabbed the sucking chest-wound decompression kit from the crash cart and secured it over the catheter site. The three-way valve would let air escape but not re-enter. One-way system. Physics kept him alive now, not hope. The Admiral's eyes opened. Unfocused at first, then searching, then finding her face. Recognition came slowly. He'd seen her twice, once 3 weeks ago when she helped a resident move him, once last week when she was reviewing his chart and caught the look in his eyes of a man who knew the hospital had stopped believing in him. "You," he said, the word barely a whisper. "Nurse Rodriguez." Katie didn't answer. She was still holding the catheter, one hand steady against his chest, monitoring his breathing, watching the rise and fall of lungs that had collapsed and shouldn't have opened again. Her other hand was on the monitor, where numbers that had been death sentences were now climbing toward normal. Her whole body was moving on a frequency that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. Surgical precision. Field emergency protocol. Remardeborn problem solving. Everything she'd spent for years learning how to forget. The door opened at 2:03 a.m. without a knock. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway in his $3,000 suit, his face moving through emotions like a flipbook, confusion, recognition, and then the cold arithmetic of threat assessment. He stared at Katie's hand still holding the catheter, at the decompression kit secured at the Admiral's chest, at the monitor showing oxygen saturation of 92% and climbing. His jaw tightened. His eyes went black. "Who authorized you to perform a physician-level procedure?" His voice came out smooth as ice water. Katie met his eyes. Didn't move her hand. Didn't flinch. He was dying. Sterling stepped into the room. His presence made the air pressure change, though not in the way the Admiral's lungs had just experienced it. This was the pressure of institutional power, of a man who'd spent a decade learning how to weaponize hospital bureaucracy. "You just breached the Scope of Practice Act. You violated about 8 different protocols. You performed an emergency surgical procedure without a physician present or an order from." "No doctor was coming," Katie said. The words came out flat. Factual. Not a request for mercy or understanding, just information. He was in tension pneumothorax. 2-minute window. You were finishing paperwork. Sterling's face didn't move, but something shifted behind his eyes. Calculation. He'd wanted the Admiral's bed for a high-income surgical case tomorrow. He'd seen a problem solving itself. Instead, he'd found his liability watching it breathe. "You know what you've done? You've handed me documentation of a nurse performing physician-only procedures. You've confessed to it. You understand you're finished at Sacred Heart? Your license board gets a single call from me, Anne." "I'll step out of the room," Katie said. "He needs continuous monitoring. 14-gauge angiocath, 2-way valve decompression. He'll need a chest X-ray to confirm full re-expansion, then a chest tube placement in the ICU. Call whoever you need to call, doctor." She moved her hand from the catheter slowly, deliberately, leaving it secure but visible. The motion was a statement, not defiance, but competence stating facts to incompetence. The catheter stayed in place. The Admiral stayed breathing. Katie crossed to the door where Sterling stood and waited with the patience of someone who'd already made peace with consequences. Sterling didn't move. His hands were balling at his sides. He'd come to room 347 expecting a death that would simplify his morning. Instead, he'd found a night shift nurse who'd stepped outside every boundary he'd constructed, who'd broken protocols he'd written, and, worst of all, who'd been right. He opened his mouth and nothing came. No accusation that stuck because the Admiral was breathing. No complaint about procedure because she'd saved a life. No excuse for his own absence because he'd been choosing his comfort over the patient's survival. The room went dead silent. Just the ventilator's mechanical rhythm and a heart monitor tracing arrhythmias that were now, finally, recovering. "Call cardiothoracic," Katie said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave. "Tell them Senior Chief Rodriguez says the Admiral needs ICU-level monitoring and a chest tube at 0600. They'll know to have everything prepped." She walked out of room 347 before Sterling could respond. Before he could recover his bearings. Before the silence broke and became something worse than the sound of a man dying. The third-floor corridor was empty at 2:04 a.m. Katie's hands were completely steady now. She walked toward the break room, and that's when her phone vibrated. A message from Miguel: "Mom? I'm coming home for 72 hours. Surprise leave. I'll be in Savannah Wednesday morning. There's something I need to tell you about the Admiral." She didn't answer. She couldn't. What she'd just done, what her hands had remembered, what her body had known to do when everything else told her to wait, had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it had worked. The Admiral was breathing. And Dr. Sterling now knew exactly what he was dealing with. By 6 in the morning, Dr. Sterling's phone had already burned through 4 calls, each one a carefully calibrated favor being cashed in. The board members who'd benefited from his coastal medical supply referrals answered before the second ring, men who understood that loyalty flowed downhill until it didn't, and right now Sterling's leverage was still solid. His voice remained smooth, almost regretful, as he outlined the situation: an unstable employee, unauthorized procedures, signs of PTSD-related impairment, a security risk to patient outcomes. None of it was quite a lie. All of it was exactly shaped to land where it needed to land. The first board member promised a hearing before lunch. The second asked if Sterling wanted him to call HR directly. The third simply said, "Consider it handled," and hung up. But phone calls to board members were just the opening move. The real architecture of her destruction required finesse. Patricia Chen, the external investigator Sterling had hired weeks earlier for what he'd framed as routine billing audits, received an email at 6:53 a.m. No urgent tone. No panic. Just a professional colleague offering additional insight. Sterling attached a spreadsheet with timestamps, 3 medication requisitions flagged with asterisks, a pattern he suggested warranted closer examination. The language was surgical: procedural inconsistencies, scope of practice concerns, variance from standard nursing protocols. He'd even helpfully highlighted the specific hours these requests had been processed, overlapping with gaps in documentation that any good auditor would flag as suspicious. Chen had been a good soldier so far. Sterling had no doubt she'd continue being one. The calls to Katie's references came between 7 and 8 o'clock, when hiring managers checked their voicemail before meetings. Sterling's tone was sympathetic, the disappointed supervisor forced to report uncomfortable truths. "I've worked with Senior Chief Rodriguez for 4 months now," he'd say, hitting that rank almost apologetically, as if invoking her military title somehow made what he was about to say more credible. "Exceptional clinical skills, no question. But there have been incidents. Moments where her judgment seems compromised. I noticed some medication discrepancies in her logs. Nothing I could prove, but given her background in combat medicine, the trauma exposure, the way she sometimes seems to disconnect from standard protocols," he'd pause here, the pause of a man carefully choosing his next words. "I'd hate to see a career derailed, but I also can't in good conscience not mention it. If you've hired her, you should know what you might be dealing with." One reference checked her criminal history immediately and found nothing. Another simply thanked him for the heads-up and marked her file as employment verification only. By the time Katie arrived for the day shift at 7 p.m., the architecture was already 3 stories tall. HR had the formal complaint filed by 8 a.m. It came from Sterling himself, submitted through the proper channels with timestamps and a detailed account of witnessing and authorized medical procedures performed by nursing staff without physician oversight. The complaint noted concerning behavioral patterns suggesting possible substance abuse given access to controlled medications. He didn't accuse her directly. He just asked questions. Implied concerns. Suggested the hospital might have liability exposure if they didn't take immediate precautions. By 11 o'clock, 2 security guards arrived at the nursing station with a cardboard box that smelled faintly of storage closets and institutional indifference. Katie was charting a patient's post-op vitals when she saw them. The way the guards moved, not hurried, not aggressive, just purposeful, told her everything before anyone said a word. The charge nurse suddenly found something very important to check in a patient room. The unit secretary looked at her keyboard like it held the secrets of the universe. Even the resident who'd been joking about his overnight call shifted his weight and suddenly needed to review something in the medical records. Ms. Rodriguez. The lead guard's voice was neutral, the voice of someone who'd done this 17 times this month. We need you to come with us. She didn't ask why. She saved that question for later, when there was no one watching. She simply logged out of the computer, set down her pen with deliberate care, and stood. Her movements were precise, economical, the physical language of someone who'd been trained that panic was a choice and dignity was a discipline. She walked between them to the locker room, where a manager in an HR polo shirt waited with a manila envelope. Your badge, the manager said quietly. Not unkindly. Just a process being followed. Katie unpinned it from her scrubs and handed it over. The laminate was still warm from being against her chest. The manager deactivated it with a scanner that beeped like a small death. Then came the locker. Everything came out into the cardboard box in front of coworkers who pretended to be doing other things, her stethoscope, coiled like a rope, the framed photo of Miguel in dress uniform, his eyes bright with something that looked like hope, the ceramic coffee mug from her first year at Sacred Heart with Healing is a Quiet Rebellion printed on the side, a sweater she'd left in case of cold OR rooms. What didn't come out of the locker, what the guards didn't notice in their systematic search of every shelf, were the combat boots at the very bottom, the one she'd hidden under a false panel she'd created months ago from a plastic storage divider and 2 surgical masks. The boots were battered tan leather, the laces worn to fraying rope, the soles patterned with the specific dust of Ramadi streets. The insoles bore her call sign burned into the leather in faded block letters, Lighthouse. She'd walked away from those boots once, when the screaming started, the kind of screaming that came from inside your own skull, the kind that made you understand why people chose to disappear rather than shatter. She'd chosen a hospital, a night shift, a borrowed identity of quiet competence. Now they were going to take even that. She couldn't ask for them. Asking would mean explaining. Explaining meant opening doors that couldn't be closed. So she just let the box be handed to her, cardboard that bent under its own weight, holding everything portable from her last 4 months of invisibility. The guards escorted her to the employee exit. It wasn't a perp walk, the hospital had more protocol than that. But it was unmistakable. By the time she reached the parking lot, 4 different nurses had seen her leave with security. By the time she got to her car, the story had already begun its transformation. Medical staff were trained to protect their own, but they were also trained to obey protocols. If HR said there was an investigation, then there must be a reason. If the badge was deactivated, then something had been wrong. That evening, Katie sat at her kitchen table, an old solid oak piece that had belonged to her mother, now holding her entire brief life at Sacred Heart spread across its surface. The discharge papers were the first thing she'd pulled, Admiral's diagnosis, the shrapnel toxicity results, the comparison labs showing his condition worsening faster than any of the Walter Reed specialists had predicted. She'd pulled them from the hospital database just before her access codes went dead, in those final minutes before security arrived. They sat in front of her now, printed on white paper with red and blue medical codes that looked like a sentence being read aloud in a language she was too tired to translate. The tears came not because of the firing, not because of Sterling's sabotage, not because of any of the visible reasons someone might cry. They came because the Admiral's creatinine was climbing, because his antibody levels were suggesting organ failure wasn't hypothetical anymore, because there was a treatment protocol at Walter Reed that required a baseline sample from someone who'd survived the exact same exposure, and that someone had just been removed from the only place where she could have helped. The front door opened at 7:43 p.m. without a key turning. Miguel had a key, and he'd been planning this for 2 weeks, a surprise 72-hour leave during a rotation window, a chance to see his mother before his deployment extended. He'd texted her the flight details but not when he'd actually arrive, wanting to see her face when he walked through the door. He'd imagined her surprise, maybe a hug, definitely questions about the new deployment location he couldn't answer yet. What he found instead was his mother at the kitchen table surrounded by medical documents, her shoulders bearing the weight of something heavier than gravity. "Mom." His voice cracked on a single word. "Why are you home? I thought you worked nights." Katie looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her face was controlled, her breathing steady even though something had clearly fractured in her. She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at her son, really looking at him, and in that moment, two realities collided: Miguel in civilian clothes, which meant leave, which meant he'd come to see her. And the Admiral's diagnosis printed in her trembling hands, which meant the man who'd stood at Miguel's graduation ceremony with his chest full of medals and his words full of pride for this young officer was dying. "Mom." Miguel moved closer, seeing her hands shake as she gathered the papers. "What happened? Are you okay?" She couldn't make words come. There was no sentence in English that bridged the gap between her Navy-hidden world and her civilian motherhood. She was a nurse who'd been fired. She was a senior chief petty officer who'd never mentioned her rank. She was the only person in the Western Hemisphere who'd survived the exact shrapnel toxicity that was currently killing his commanding officer, and she'd been escorted from the hospital before she could volunteer that fact to anyone who might save his life. Miguel saw the discharge papers her hands couldn't release. "Mom, what is that?" His voice was different now, officer's voice, not son's voice. "Why do you have discharge papers for Admiral Whitmore?" The question hung in the kitchen like a held breath. She looked at her son and saw the boy whose commanding officer was dying. She looked at the papers in her hands and saw the evidence of her own helplessness, filed away in medical codes that meant nothing to anyone except the people whose bodies they described. "I don't understand," Miguel whispered, and Katie could hear the fear underneath the confusion, the officer's tactical mind already running through permutations of what this could mean. "Why do you have his medical records? You're just a nurse. Why are you crying?" But that wasn't the question he was asking. The real question lived behind his eyes. What are you hiding, and does it have something to do with why our Admiral is dying? Katie opened her mouth. No words came. Then Miguel's phone buzzed. A text from the neurosurgery department at Walter Reed, ADM Whitmore condition deteriorated 0300 hours. Family notification advised. Contact officer on file for deployment status implications. Miguel looked at the phone. He looked at his mother. He looked at the Admiral's diagnosis papers slowly being crushed in her trembling hands. And for the first time since he'd become an officer, he asked a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Mom, what happened?" The rotor wash hit the helipad like a physical force, rattling every window on the third floor of Sacred Heart as the UH-60M Black Hawk descended through the grey dawn. The sound was a language Katie hadn't heard in 8 years, a mechanical heartbeat that meant movement, purpose, and no possibility of remaining invisible. Through the lobby windows, medical staff froze mid-stride, watching the helicopter settle onto the landing pad with the precision of a creature that had touched down in 1,000 combat zones. The rotor blade slowed. The doors opened. And then the boots hit the concrete. For SEAL team operators in dress uniforms walked past the security checkpoint without slowing, without ID, without hesitation. The senior enlisted man, a woman with Cortez stenciled over her left breast pocket, had eyes that had seen things the cafeteria staff would never understand. Behind her came 2 more operators and a Navy medical officer with captain's insignia, all moving with the kind of coordinated purpose that made civilians instinctively step aside. The security guard reached for his radio and then thought better of it. These people weren't asking for permission. They were executing an order. The team leader approached the front desk, and her voice cut through the morning noise like a blade through silk. "We need Senior Chief Rodriguez. Night shift nurse." She wasn't reading a name from a clipboard. She was confirming an identity that was already known, already catalogued, already classified. The receptionist's face went pale. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then she reached for the phone with trembling fingers. In the waiting room outside the ICU, Miguel sat in his navy dress whites, the shoulder boards of a full lieutenant catching the fluorescent light. He'd been sitting there since 5 a.m., uniform pressed, boots shined, jaw set like a man preparing for a court-martial. When he heard the rotor blade settle and saw the SEAL team cross the lobby, he stood. His hand moved instinctively to his collar, a gesture from childhood, checking that his uniform was correct, that he was ready, that he could face whatever came next. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor. Katie stepped out in her scrubs, still damp from the night shift, her name badge hanging crooked, her hair in a loose braid that had survived 12 hours of crisis and medication distribution. She didn't see the team at first. She was thinking about Admiral Whitmore's chart, about the new lab results from 4 hours ago, about whether the chelation protocol was holding. Then Cortez stepped directly into her path, and Katie stopped. Senior Chief Rodriguez. It wasn't a question. It was a salute delivered in words. Katie's entire body went still. The world narrowed. The badge in her hand, just a nurse, Sacred Heart Hospital, Katie Rodriguez, suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. She couldn't finish the sentence. No one had called her by that rank in 8 years. No one was supposed to know. The invisibility that had kept her alive, kept her hidden, kept everyone around her safe from what she was, it shattered like tempered glass. The Admiral's being transferred to Walter Reed. Cortez's voice was quiet but carried the weight of command. His toxicity markers are unique. Extremely rare. Your case file from 2019 is the only match in every medical database we accessed. You survived the exact shrapnel exposure that's killing him. Your blood work, your chelation therapy notes, your recovery protocol, you're the only data point we have for survival. The captain beside her stepped forward, reading from an iPad. The Pentagon is requesting your immediate cooperation. This isn't optional, Senior Chief. Katie's hands were shaking now, but not from fear. From something older. Something she'd buried in scrub drawers and covered in 8 years of night shifts and anonymous competence. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the ICU doors swung wide and Miguel appeared in his full dress uniform, the Navy insignia sharp as knives against his chest. He looked at his mother for the first time as what she actually was, not as the woman who made breakfast and asked about his day, but as Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, decorated combat medic, the ghost who'd raised him while disappearing from every mirror. Senior Chief Petty Officer, Miguel said, and his voice cracked with 8 years of pride he'd never been allowed to speak aloud. My CO at Naval Station Kings Bay told me about the Admiral's condition. He told me to tell you, Miguel swallowed hard. The Admiral wrote me letters during deployment. Personal letters, not official correspondence. He never told me who the medic was in Ramadi. The one who kept working under fire. The one who saved his convoy when the IED detonated. He just said, there was someone there who wouldn't let us die. Senior Chief, that was you. That was my mother. Katie couldn't speak. The tears came without permission, without dignity, without the composure she'd maintained through every humiliation Dr. Sterling had delivered. They simply came, running down her face while Navy personnel watched and the morning light cut through the windows like a judgment she'd been running from for 8 years. A trembling resident appeared at the ICU desk, iPad in hand, eyes moving rapidly across a file. When she looked up and matched the name on the screen to the woman standing in scrubs in the middle of the lobby, her face shifted through disbelief and recognition in 4 seconds flat. That's, the resident swallowed. You have 3 Navy crosses in this file. And 2 Purple Hearts. The words died on her lips because there was no way to finish the sentence that didn't sound absurd. This woman had emptied bedpans on night shift. This woman had taken abuse from Dr. Sterling without flinching. This woman had somehow become a decorated combat veteran standing in the lobby of a civilian hospital in Savannah, Georgia, wearing a hospital badge that said just a nurse. Cortez placed a hand on Katie's shoulder, not a restraint, but a connection. You performed a needle decompression 36 hours ago. On Admiral Whitmore. Tension pneumothorax, no backup, no protocol, perfect execution under pressure. Cortez's eyes held Katie's like iron holding iron. You didn't walk away from anything, Senior Chief. You're still in the fight. We need you to save one more life. The Admiral's life. And we're not asking permission. In the hospital's administrative suite on the 4th floor, Dr. Sterling was receiving an entirely different kind of visit. The FBI agents wore dark suits that cost more than his Omega watch, and they carried an iPad with time-stamped security footage that made the color drain from his face in stages. "This is you," the first agent said, pointing to grainy video of Sterling entering the medication supply room at 11:13 p.m. on a Tuesday 3 weeks prior. "And this is you," showing footage of him meeting with 2 men in the parking garage wearing Coastal Medical Supply polo shirts. "And this is you," the video cycling to him handwriting instructions on a piece of hospital letterhead, his handwriting unmistakable, the words redirecting medication inventory to private accounts. Marcus Chen stood to the side, a Marine corporal's anchor tattooed on his forearm, visible through his rolled-up IT department sleeve. He held an external hard drive that contained deleted files, security footage Sterling thought he'd erased, metadata he believed was gone, timestamps that proved pharmaceutical rerouting and billing fraud spanning 18 months. His voice was calm, precise, delivered with the clarity of someone who'd worked in comms. "You used hospital wiping software, but you didn't understand that hospital-grade encryption keeps shadow copies in 17 different locations. I found them all." Dr. Sterling opened his mouth. His attorney, who'd arrived 30 seconds after the agents entered his office, placed a hand on his arm. The attorney shook his head slowly. "Not a word. Don't say a single word." Sterling's jaw clenched so hard his molars ached. He looked from the agents to Marcus to the iPad with the footage, and the calculation he'd been performing in his head since Tuesday morning simply stopped. There was no negotiation. No favor he could call in. No board member he could reach who wouldn't now be receiving federal subpoenas. The Lake House closing had been postponed indefinitely. By noon, Sterling was on administrative leave pending investigation by the DEA, the Department of Justice, and the hospital's board of directors. His access badges were deactivated. His office was sealed. His name was removed from the directory before lunch. The same walk Katie had taken 24 hours earlier, but Sterling made it surrounded by whispers, not whispers of hidden strength, but whispers of unraveling power. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez walked through downtown Savannah in Navy dress uniform, the kind that required permission to wear in public, the kind that meant medals were authorized for display. Her service dress white uniform reflected the spring sunlight, and every person who passed her offered recognition without knowing her name. She'd spent the last half year at Walter Reed, working with Admiral Whitmore's medical team, presenting her chelation therapy protocol at 3 medical conferences, and training a new cohort of combat medics in how to transition from field medicine to civilian healthcare. She passed a strip mall near the river. And she stopped. At a folding table under a faded beach umbrella that had probably been white before 3 summers of Savannah heat had weathered it to cream, Dr. Sterling sat with insurance brochures fanned out in neat rows. He was wearing a wrinkled polo shirt with no name tag. His designer watch was gone, replaced by a digital Casio that probably cost $30 at a big box store. A small laminated sign read supplemental health coverage plans in printed letters that would never stand out in a crowd. He was calling out to passers-by in a voice that had lost all of its edge. "Health insurance options? Nobody thinks about supplemental coverage until it's too late." Most people kept walking. A few took a brochure out of politeness and threw it away at the next trash can. Sterling's expression had the kind of resignation that comes from knowing exactly what you deserve and having to live with it anyway. He looked up and saw Katie in her dress uniform, medals arranged across her chest in the proper order, Bronze Star, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, Navy Cross again, and something in his face simply broke. He looked away. He became invisible in his own humiliation, which was perhaps the greatest punishment someone like him could endure. Katie didn't stop. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge him at all. She simply walked on, because that's what strength does. It doesn't need revenge. It just needs forward motion. Sacred Heart's new Veterans Transition Wing opened on the 1st of June, and Admiral Whitmore, healthy now, color restored, breathing without labor, cut the ribbon in a ceremony that nobody expected would be as powerful as it was. The facility was designed to help combat medical personnel transition into civilian healthcare roles, to provide mentorship and community and the kind of understanding that only comes from people who've held life together with their own hands while the world was trying to explode around them. In the lobby, a glass display case held Katie's worn combat boots, the ones she'd kept hidden in the bottom of her locker, the ones from Ramadi, the ones that had walked through 1,000 impossible moments. A bronze plaque was mounted below them, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. Lighthouse. Some healers served twice. Katie stood in front of a case with Miguel beside her, both of them in uniform now, both of them no longer hiding. Miguel was assigned to Naval Station Kings Bay, close enough to have lunch with his mother in the cafeteria where Dr. Sterling had once knocked her tray to the floor. Every nurse who passed them stopped. Every physician acknowledged the uniform. Every person in the hospital understood now that they'd been working alongside something they hadn't recognized, not a nursing deficit, but a strength so complete it didn't need to announce itself. Marcus Chen from IT joined them with his own tray, the Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm, the ease of a man who'd finally stopped pretending. Senior Chief, we've got 3 more veteran applicants for the program. All combat medics. All struggling with the transition, like you were. He said it gently, without judgment. Katie set down her coffee cup and met his eyes with the clarity of someone who'd finally stopped running. Send them to me. Nobody should have to hide who they are to heal. Through the cafeteria windows, spring sunlight caught the American flag at half-staff for a fallen service member somewhere in the world. Katie watched it ripple in the breeze, thought of all the people she'd picked up, in Ramadi under fire, in Sacred Heart under pressure, in her own mirror when she finally decided to stop disappearing. Admiral Whitmore called from the Pentagon that evening, his voice strong and certain. Senior Chief, the Navy wants to expand the transition program to 15 more hospitals nationwide. They're requesting your signature on the expansion proposal. Katie said yes without hesitation, because she understood now what it meant to step out of the shadows. The world was safer when people like her were visible. The world was better when heroes didn't have to hide. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Subscribe for more stories about the people nobody notices until everything depends on them. Like this video and let us know in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?